Very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone from sunny northern Wisconsin. I'm Dave Ulrich, formerly of Region 5 and then Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. Greatly appreciate all of you joining us today for this Academy session. We have an action-packed agenda for you. In my own experience, one of the elements of environmental and sustainability enterprise that has really presented some of the biggest challenges has been the federal, state, local, and tribal dynamic and how to get that to work effectively. All clearly have very important roles to play, and there's more than enough work to go around and limited human and financial resources. Today, we're focused on federal, state, and local interrelationships. We're going to have a separate one on federal, state, and tribal interactions. My goal for the session is that we get a better understanding of this dynamic and what it might take to make it work even better in the future. We're very fortunate to have three outstanding panelists with extensive experience in public service to share their perception on what works, what doesn't work, and what might work better in the future. Chris Wheat worked for the City of Chicago in a variety of capacities, also for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and now is with the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Tom Burek, our second panelist, served as commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, president of the Environmental Council of States, and has a distinguished, very distinguished legal career as well. And finally, and certainly not least, is my colleague from way back when, Kathy Callahan, who worked in a variety of program areas for US EPA in Region 2, New York, and included deputy and acting regional administrator, and after leaving EPA in academia and consulting. Chris will be our first speaker, and then Tom and Kathy to tell us a little bit about their responsibilities and positions they held where interaction with other orders of government was part of their job responsibilities, and a little bit about the nature of those interactions. After each one speaks for 5 or 10 minutes, we will open the screen, not the floor, the screen, to questions from the audience, which I request you put in the chat box as the session moves along. Also, a very, very special request. If people who are in the audience would kindly mute their microphones, it would be deeply appreciated. We've picked up all sorts of interesting background over the years. You might want to consider closing out the speaker view, although I enjoy seeing all of you so much. You might leave it on, but you can turn off your camera, and then you can focus on speaker view if you want to look at just the person who is speaking. So for starters, Chris, the screen is yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dave, and greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here and be involved in this conversation. You know, in the interest of full disclosure, I am not ex-EPA, and as Dave alluded to, all of my work in the environmental space has been on the local side. So I spent 7 years in Chicago City Hall under the Emanuel administration, and a few different positions, including Chief Sustainability Officer, and also as Mayor Emanuel's Chief of Policy. And then I spent 2 years at NRDC, helping run a program called the American Cities Climate Challenge, which focuses on 25 cities around the country and providing the technical, the policy and political support to get more work done at the local level. And so a lot of my comments and thoughts will very much take on the perspective of local governments, and also, think about, something that explicitly, doesn't fall within the purview often of career staff is the politics and kind of what is the political pulse that we're seeing in a lot of cities. And although my day job is not in the environmental space exclusively now at the University of Chicago, my night and weekend job is I do serve as a consultant to Bloomberg Philanthropies on their climate work. So I'm still keeping up and learning about a lot of the good work that y'all are doing. So let's go back 4 years, which maybe a lot of you don't necessarily want to do. But from the local or city perspective, the political atmosphere made the White House, the administration, the federal government, and at some level, EPA, at least in concept, an easy target. And I say in concept because, often for many parts of the government, particularly local political folks, they may not operate or interact with the EPA on a regular basis. You may be connecting with the local folks who are, running water treatment, the local Department of Environment, folks who are working on specific policy pieces. But the political folks, they may be interacting with some senior staff. They may occasionally have a meeting with, someone in the regional administrator's office. But it's still an element of nebulousness with local governments, which I think is different than, say, a HUD or a DOJ, where there are or a Department of Education, where there are parts of the local government that may be interacting on a very regular basis with those federal officials because there may be direct funding happening. There's direct funding, in the form of community development CDBG funds, often the HUD. So it often happens, and I interacted with a lot of EPA officials, but that purview can be relatively limited. So because of that, the administration and federal government was just an easy target. It was just easy to say, like, we're doing this thing against the president, and that was pretty much all you needed to get to yes. I think that there was, some element to differentiate political versus career staff. So one of the projects that our team worked on was when the climate change section of the EPA website went down. It was my team who worked on putting that back up on the City of Chicago servers. We did that. I think 19 other cities followed suit. It was also it was something telling about that moment, though, and it was showing something about the politics of the environment. I remember, there were people just walking up to Mayor Emanuel, thanking him for doing that. And typically, people don't come up to Mayor Emanuel and talk about the environment. They complain about a pothole or whatnot. And so it did actually signal for us that there was something in the air about the political landscape that was changing. It was changing relatively rapidly. There was also support for AFGE and the union employees. There was a lot of speculation early on about what happens to the Region 5 office and where was that office going to get shut down and whatnot. And so there was a lot of hay made around that. So frankly, there were political moments that were almost created by default by the nature of the administration that cities were able to really lean into. Today, there is an element of the dog catching the car. And so cities are trying to think about, what do they do in terms of their local climate policy? What is the frame of that climate work now if the frame is not automatically a retort to the federal government? And so I think that cities are still looking for that frame. Cities often also have, in varying degrees, depending on the nature of the city and nature of the state, have varying levels of jurisdictional control. And that varies widely from state to state. So I think there is still an element of cities trying to figure out what to do now. I think also cities are at some level twiddling their thumbs, waiting to see what happens in Congress. over the next few months with infrastructure plans, with FY22 budget, surface transportation, you kind of name the list. And so, especially with budget squeezed at the city side, because often cities are dependent on sales taxes, revenue into their downtown cores, tourism, et cetera, and with those numbers being down, I think cities are still trying to figure out they're in this element of permanent austerity. Another thing I think cities are thinking about, they're being pushed for more solutions that are more intersectional. So how does working in the environment and issues of water quality, how does that connect back to economic development? How does that connect to housing? How does that connect to the buzzword of equity? And I say buzzword not to be dismissive of it, but it kind of has become everything to everyone. And so what that means in terms of the interactions with EPA is that often they are looking for solutions that just are simply outside your building, or necessitate a level of interaction and cooperation with the building. And connected to that, cities often, local governments don't talk EPA or don't talk federal government. They don't understand that language. And often the federal government doesn't understand local either. And I'm sure Dave can speak and attest to that as well. And so understanding how those connections and how that translation happens is very difficult. At the same time, there is this question of what does the political environment look like? There's obviously a hard turn to more progressive candidates over the last 4 years. I think there's an open question in terms of what, will that push continue? At the same time, there's obviously a mayoral election in New York. Yesterday, you're seeing elections in Seattle and a lot of other cities as well. And I think it's safe to say that the most progressive candidate is not automatically winning. They're not winning for a myriad of different reasons. And a lot of those are local to that area. But I think there's still a question of kind of what is the nature of the political landscape for cities, and then how they interact from there. So that's some of the stuff that I think cities are thinking about. I do think that they're still committed and searching for good solutions, and have a very open door to thinking about what cooperation can look like in this new environment. So I will stop there and looking forward to the conversation.
Very good, Chris. Right on the money in terms of timing. Moving right along, Tom, please tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Great. Thank you very much, Dave. And thank you all for the opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon and be part of this conversation. Let me talk briefly about my experience. Then I just want to share an overall perspective and just describe a little bit of the work that I've done in this arena that I think may shed some light on some of the conversations we've already begun here. I have had the privilege of seeing government from the perspective of all three branches of government, first as an environmental legislative assistant to a US Senator, then as a law clerk on our state Supreme Court here in New Hampshire, and most recently, as Dave indicated, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Services here in the state for 10 years from 2006 to 2016. I served under two different governors, both of whom were Democrats. My first 2 years of service were under the last years of the Bush administration, and then of course 8 years during the Obama administration. The department itself has an annual budget of some $200 to $250 million a year, about 475 FTEs, and it administers roughly 36 laws and over 100 different sets of regulations. And importantly, and I think this speaks to a point Chris was making a moment ago, it has delegation or authorization under all of the major delegable programs that EPA is charged with running, with the exception of the NPDES program under the Clean Water Act. And that's important because I think it illustrates one of the major reasons why Chris was observing that cities often don't have a whole lot of interaction with the EPA. It's because a lot of what EPA in the early years would have been doing is now being done by states. So states effectively sort of are in the middle there between the cities and EPA in many instances. And that brings me to just an overall perspective that I want to share before I jump into a few details here. My experience, given this whole, what we might call a national environmental enterprise, is that what matters most is really delivering on mission in a manner that actually protects human health and the environment. That's what people are looking for. And so I find myself taking guidance from Bill Ruckelshaus, from his early sort of directive to the agency, which is that within this enterprise, effectively, we all need to follow the law, follow the science, be transparent. And to that, I add one more important element, and that is to be collaborative. Because the public, for the most part, doesn't distinguish between or among these different branches or let alone orders of government. If for most members of the public and most regulated parties, my experience is that anything that happens in the name of environmental protection was due to the EPA. And they just don't distinguish among us, among these different levels of government. If we're delivering environmental protection, if they're receiving something that's helpful to them, protective of their public health, EPA is responsible for that. And so what any order of government does in this arena, my belief is going to reflect on all orders of government and vice versa. Something goes well, everybody benefits. Something doesn't go well, it reflects badly on all levels of government in most instances. So effectively, we're all in this together. That's my perspective. And it's one of the main reasons why I have really focused my work in this arena, particularly when I've had the privilege of being in public service, on this notion of collaboration as the key to effective and successful environmental protection. Because if we do a good job, then we make ourselves and everyone else look good, and we win the public's support and their cooperation, which is so vital to our collective success. So where have I spent my time? Well, I was a commissioner of a state agency. I spent a lot of time in dealing with EPA on funding and how that funding was going to be used through processes like the Performance Partnership Agreement, Performance Partnership Grant Program. Those occupied a lot of my time and staff time. And at the same time, because we effectively were that middleman, we also spent a lot of time administering grant and loan programs. I used to tell people that NHDES was in fact just a very large bank, because we had somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion of grant and loan funds that we were distributing and managing through the various, particularly state revolving funds. Permitting actions, monitoring, outreach and compliance assistance and education, as well as enforcement, were all key elements of what I was working on if I was interacting particularly with EPA and sometimes with municipalities as well. But I will also tell you that as an ECOS officer, my focus was on what we could do to improve state-federal relations. So I want to talk just for a moment here about my primary interactions with the other orders of government. And important to recognize, and again, this goes to a point Chris was making as well, it's important to recognize that it wasn't a matter of DES interacting just with EPA or just with municipalities. We also had to have really strong relations with the other state agencies within our own state, but also the other agencies doing similar work in the neighboring states, in the regions, in the states around us, as well as at a national level. Effectively, if the state was going to operate as a single enterprise and all work sort of toward common objectives. So let's turn then to municipalities. What are the issues that at least DES regularly was dealing with munis? Well, a big chunk of it was this issue of funding, of grants and loans, drinking water, wastewater, brownfields. At the same time, a lot of interactions with municipalities that were looking for help in solving problems, whether it was contaminated sites, facility permitting, whether they either did or didn't want a facility in their community to get permitted, or concerns they had. Drinking water supply contamination, particularly with PFAS, became a big issue my last few years of service. But increasingly, another area that we can't lose sight of, and Chris again, I think referenced this, is disaster preparedness, response and recovery, and resiliency. And that became an ever more significant piece of the work that we were doing with the municipalities. as climate has changed and been changing pretty rapidly here in New England, and I believe in many other parts of the country. Let me just flip to the federal government interactions quickly here. Certainly, we interacted with EPA Region 1, with headquarters on some matters, but then with a whole slew of other agencies, whether it was the Corps of Engineers, OSHA, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a fairly large national forest here, so the Forest Service, as well as Department of Energy on some matters. But specifically with respect to EPA, again, the PPA, PPG process was important and time consuming. Funding needs generally, occasional enforcement matters would come up between us. And then topics of shared interest or shared jurisdiction, like water quality issues involving our Great Bay Estuary here in the state, was something that I personally worked quite closely with our regional administrator on. But increasingly climate change issues as well as wetlands permitting. But I want to just take one more moment here and just talk about what we did at the national level, starting really focusing in about 2011, 2012, which was forming an initiative called E-Enterprise for the Environment, which we chartered. In fact, Administrator Gina McCarthy signed the charter in 2013 at an ECOS meeting as a shared governance initiative, initially just between the states and EPA, subsequently amended to include very explicitly the tribes as well, with the goal of modernizing the delivery of environmental protection services in this country. And the whole initiative is premised on the basic notion that problems are best addressed when all of the parties first define what the problem is and why it's a problem, to whom it's a problem, how it might be a different kind of problem to where you sit, because you're gonna have a different perception of it, and then together designing and implementing a solution that actually works and works for everybody, so that we're not off in our own little worlds, defining the problem, coming up with a solution that turns out creates other problems for another branch of government. This is all about early and meaningful dialogue with the partners who make decisions together. It's about streamlining and simplifying processes. Continuous improvement, lean, is an important tool in this toolbox. It's about leveraging technology where it makes sense to optimize the effectiveness of what we're doing here. And it comes back to a point, Dave, you made at the outset, which is collectively among EPA, states, and tribes, we only have limited resources. We only have limited time. We have lots of brain power, but it really only makes sense, therefore, to collaborate, to pool our talent, pool our funding, build things once that we can then use over and over again and constantly improve. It's all about collaboration. That's where I think the future lies. And I'll stop there.
Perfect, Tom. Thank you so much. Let me remind people, as I just did in the chat box, that keep your questions coming in. Don't have any yet, but I'm sure we'll be generating some very soon. Kathy, it's now your turn to give a little bit of the federal perspective on this fascinating intergovernmental dynamic. Take it away.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, colleagues. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, and I appreciate being invited, Chuck and Dave. It's been over 10 years since I last worked for EPA in Region 2, all of it. But the 35 years that I was there provided a pretty broad learning experience for me, especially on the topic that we're sort of focusing on today is the clash of the titans. When I began employment with EPA, I was an enforcement analyst in the Enforcement Division. We took to heart Bill Wurkelshaus' statement. He made a lot of good ones, didn't he? But anyway, unless states have a gorilla in the closet, they can't do the job. And that gorilla is EPA. And just this weekend, I was kind of reminded at a family Father's Day brunch, the topic drifted on to politics, as it often will for a while. And one of my brothers said about something, oh, sure, the federal government comes down with its big bludgeon on everyone. Doesn't he remember his sister worked for it? But anyway, So as I prepared for today's discussion, these two thoughts were sort of, framing what I was thinking. And are we really gorillas at EPA? Are we bludgeoners? Was that then? What's now? So I learned early on that while the federal environmental legislation helped structure U.S. efforts to clean our obviously deteriorating environment at the time, the job was not just for the feds. But our early efforts were truthfully focused on independent EPA enforcement. We were very proud of our enforcement cases and injunctive reliefs without consultation with the states. We often opined among ourselves, most of the time, that the states did not have our skill and legal structures. And not, it was quiet, but it was an undercurrent. But time changed that. Problems changed that. The regional geographic range wouldn't let that remain status quo. The states of New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico developed analogous agencies to EPA right around the time of EPA's establishment. And New York and New Jersey became powerhouse regulators on their own. The VI took about a decade longer to get an organization in place outside of its health department, and that dealt with clean water issues. So in the Virgin Islands, we were always dealing with two sets of agencies on the environmentally related issues. However, both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands always suffered from the lack of funding to allow them to maintain sufficient experienced staff. So that was a unique aspect, largely unlike New York and New Jersey. They had their financial problems, but much, much less so. So the early clashes began, and they rose, as I think back on them, out of several areas, which are prevalent now, but dealt with differently, I'm grateful to say, in most cases. Legal authorities and complex interactions between state and federal levels, between state law and federal law and state law, between federal courts and state courts. Who had principal authority? Would what the feds were doing mesh with what the state and local authorities were doing and wanted to do? And we had a really early confrontation with New York City and about the newly established national air pollutant controls. And this was in the Ruckelshaus days, so it was early on. And New York said it had anticipated the EPA's rulemaking, and its city council was dealing with the same kind of rules, and they didn't want to be under an EPA enforcement action. No way, no how. It turned out that they were, and we made a lot of progress, but the issues became more and more complex. And so some things played out in courts, and unfortunately, in many respects, and to the good in others, federal legislation became more elaborate and detailed. And there was an effort, many efforts at levels in the federal government and in other state and municipal governments to be crystal clear about what their desires were, what they wanted, how they wanted to constrain their own activities. The New York City example that I use brings in another factor of our titanic clashes: politics. New York State and New Jersey, as I said, quickly, became strong environmental advocates. And the early days of our coordination were often annual or semi-annual meetings of state commissioners and regional administrators with tension-filled discussions that even occasionally deteriorated to screaming matches. They were not an opportunity to communicate and to share goals. There was much tension. So, no wonder that the sense of clash continues. Politics in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands were very different. They were complex and difficult in different ways. Just as an example, in Puerto Rico for annual meetings, the the regional administrator and staff, senior staff, always met with the governor, always, in his mansion, and it was quite an extraordinary experience. EPA people were like rock stars walking out of the governor's mansion with the newspaper people down at the bottom of the stairs saying, "What did you talk to the governor about?" Whereas in the Virgin Islands, we were ghosted by the governor a couple of times. People at the meeting just said, "Oh, the governor is off island today." We had set these things up for months. They didn't show up. So another kind of difference. Of course, it's been mentioned, and one of the other key continuing tensions that exist is funding. Early in EPA's existence, for example, a substantial amount of federal funds could be brought to bear for wastewater and drinking water, construction of plants and infrastructure. But many new pieces of federal requirements that came along afterwards address problems aimed at the private sector through states with delegation possible and primacy, and there was lots of tension there. Were the state programs the equivalent of the EPA programs? Should states take on new federal programs without commensurate funding? New Jersey's legislature considered not enacting state requirements that were more stringent than than the federal requirements, which they had a history of doing, which was another set of tensions. It didn't pass, but these things were always part of the conversation, making already incredibly difficult issues more difficult. And part of the underlying cost issue was the effect of compliance and enforcement on the regulated community, whether private entities, municipal government, the agricultural communities, and you could go on and on. Federal legislation and interpretations were often structured in a rigid format, and examples would inevitably arise that didn't fit the structure, that were unanticipated, as I think Chris said, but maybe it was Tom. And so how do we deal with that? It's hard for us at the federal level to be flexible, even where we see something unique going on. And I think that's improved, but this is what created these clashes. Part of the federal approach was also designed to provide equity across state lines initially. We did not want regulated entities moving from one state to another because of an environmental economic advantage. Equity for communities didn't emerge for decades and were largely instigated by local non-governmental organizations and in some cases local governments. But for EPA, we relied initially on the non-governmental organizations to really, okay, clue us in. We just haven't been paying attention. Pragmatically and with communities, we tried to achieve equity across regions and often even struggled with each other, surrounded by laws and regulations and a lack of political consensus and funding. So how do you achieve a healthy environment in this? Which is not to say we haven't made progress, but we have so much still facing us. So the legal structures that I've seen as critical are politics, funding, and the cost of funding and the cost of compliance, equity, and these created the atmosphere that, made all of us wrangle with each other over how to make progress and what our real goals were, how to come to a consensus on those goals, as Tom was saying. As the science improved, it left still many unanswered questions, even today. Issues of natural aspects of localities entered the discussion, and more. In the Southwest, arsenic was in drinking water at levels that exceeded what Superfund was using as a risk-based level for companies to clean up. The coral reefs in the Virgin Islands were dying, And we really, in the regional office, didn't have the expertise to understand it, to advocate for research, to really just dig into that as an issue. It just kind of sat up there and we said, we don't have any regulatory direction. Not good.
Kathy,
Yeah.
I think we're going to need to wrap up.
All
And
right. Well, I was
please.
almost there, Dave. So if I can just say, all of these things were tough. We accomplished a lot through communication, collaboration, building relationships, and still we have far to go. And climate change, both the mitigation aspect and the response aspect face us. So it's a challenging world still.
Well, very good, Kathy. Thanks you so much. The number of times over the years I said, nobody said this was going to be easy. It was very true. And your mentioning of the gorilla in the closet, I never aspired to be a gorilla, let alone one in the closet. But I can remember my state colleagues saying, you're wonderful gorillas in the closet, but just make sure you
Stay there, right?
So we got a lot of that. So speaking of that, Tom, you introduced a term that others touched on a little bit as well, collaboration, and might be a little bit overused and under practiced as well. But tell me a little bit about the techniques that you use to kind of lay the groundwork for collaboration, and then I'll ask Chris and Kathy to talk about it a little bit as well. But what kinds of things do you do to try to create an atmosphere for collaboration?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. I think one of the real challenges we have is trying to understand the difference between what does it mean to cooperate with each other. That is this whole notion of cooperative federalism versus what would it mean to collaborate with each other? What would a collaborative federalism, which is what I like to talk about, look like? And it's fairly nuanced, but I think in a cooperative approach, really what you're doing is you're just trying to get others to agree to what you are already planning or want to do. Whereas in a world of collaboration, you are saying we must all have a problem that we might define differently from each other. Let's understand this problem from everybody's perspective. And rather than whether it's EPA or a state or a city trying to impose our solution on everybody, let's make sure that we all have a common understanding of what that problem is, and then can agree on a way to approach it that actually can work in the real world. It's very easy, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but candidly, a lot of the concern, I think, in the early years, and maybe in the more recent years as well, from states is that folks in EPA and headquarters in particular would write rules that were very well intentioned, but that in practical reality could be very difficult, if not impossible, to implement in a timely or cost-effective way. So how do you go about doing collaboration? Well, I think it starts with some pretty basic stuff. It starts with building trust among people. And that means starting with just treating everybody with dignity and respect. It means seeing everybody as co-equals and not in a hierarchical rank order sense. It means really listening to understand, not just listening so that you then have your chance to respond. And again, this notion of joint problem definition, joint solution development. I found that skills that one picks up doing continuous process improvement, that is lean, where you're really looking at a process and taking it apart and understanding why do we do this step? Why do we do it this way? Is a very useful way of getting people to come together and realize that maybe what we built isn't necessarily the best, the best a mousetrap here. Maybe there's a better way to build this mousetrap. I've also found that trying to imagine what alternative futures could look like, that is doing scenario thinking, scenario planning, asking what if questions, can be a really, really useful tool. The other thing that I will tell you that was more applicable within my agency than more broadly, but was in some ways the thing I am most proud of what I did during my 10 years at DES, was to just develop a speechcraft program for our staff members so that many of our staff members now, I think at this point, over a quarter of the DES, if not closer to half of the DES staff, have been through a basic just public speaking training class, so that they could get comfortable with themselves, get comfortable that they could communicate effectively with others in a small setting or a larger setting, and effectively become ambassadors for environmental protection. And I believe that the skills they've learned from that have also helped them to become better collaborators and storytellers with other levels, I shouldn't say other levels, other orders of government, whether the federal or local. So let me stop there, and I'm really interested to hear what Kathy and Chris have experienced.
Yeah, Chris, your thoughts on how to create an atmosphere for better collaboration among the different orders of government?
Well, a few thoughts. I think one, to Tom's point, the concept of joint problem definition is critical because you all may be solving different problems. And so given the nature of the mandate, right, that's provided to a specific agency or a specific government by their legislative body or charter or whatnot, the jurisdictional issues that we've talked about that Tom and Kathleen mentioned as well, make it paramount to focus in on the problem definition. And I think connected to that is you don't, and I don't mean this to be flip, but you don't have to cooperate all the time. Like, everyone is busy. Everyone's got a lot of stuff on their plate. And I think that, some of it is how do you create an environment where you can overshare at some level, where you're sharing kind of what you're working on, what you're thinking about with colleagues in different parts of government, but also kind of understand that, you don't have to have a partnership over everything. I do think at times, those cross-departmental, cross-agency meetings, everyone shows up to the first one, and they'll probably show up to the second one. It's the third one where people just stop. If you're not providing something of value, like, people just stop coming. And then you have to manage this. You have to manage this task force of all the people who don't want to come to this meeting. So I think, having understanding appreciation of timing, I think is critically important as well, and that the priority may just look and feel different depending on the nature of where that discussion is, today.
Very good, Chris. I always found that getting people to show up for meetings, good coffee and donuts always help. So I got many more repeat occurrences, and because the federal government couldn't pay for it, I shelled out of my own pocket, but it was worth it. Kathy, your thoughts?
Okay, but I'll tell you one very quick funny story. With some colleagues from New Jersey, we were really working with a thorny issue. I felt I didn't have any flex on it. We always would have, like that, coffee and donuts for the meetings, and we met frequently, not just on the thorny issues, but all issues. And they came to the door this one particular day, and they went, "Oh no, look at what they've spread on the table. They're never going to agree with us," because there was too much. It was like, I said, "Well, if I can't say yes, at least I can feed you." But I mean, in one sense, that kind of respect for the people that even you had to disagree with at times is what I hope I was able to bring to various situations that I was in. Tom, your definition of collaboration is beautiful, right on. And Chris, your almost self-evident comment that we all have a million things to do is also right on. So, there's this both on how do we interact with each other personally, because so much of, we can't always fix politics. We can't always find new money, but we're there with one another. So how do we use our skills to work around problems and look at what comes next, the mission goals, right? Some of the mission goals from the past that I was sort of looking back on are still important, but there are these new mission goals of the future. How are we going to balance those out? And how will we use enhanced knowledge of, I hope, group interactions, individual interactions, political, overcoming political divides to help us get there. So, I think we have a nice basis for the three of us now, even just between the three of us, where would we go next?
Very good. I always remember my first trip to the state of Michigan, and they opened the meeting by saying, well, you need to understand that our number one goal is to keep you out of this state. Just send the money and just stay away. And I thought that was, not the best beginning to a working relationship, but we worked through that. One of the questions that came in asked about the state of maturity, if you will, of the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and really RCRA, Superfund, TSCA, all of them have been around quite a while and really have not been amended that extensively. There have been amendments. And so we've got mature laws and programs, and there has been a tremendous increase in if you will, capacity and sophistication at all levels, local, state, and federal levels. How is this maturation, if you will, 50 years down the road, how does that make things different at this? Kathy, do you want to start out with that? I know you've been away a little while, but you saw at least 40 of those 50 years almost. Well, maybe a little less than 40.
Yeah.
But
Well,
what about how things have evolved?
and I can say this because I'm not in the heart of of the beast anymore. But certain things that we've done are historic. They've made this country what it is: clean drinking water, clean sewage, clean rivers. There's more of that to be done, but there's also these are old facilities now. They have to be reinvigorated. And there are many other aspects of what goes on, but can we make some tough choices and say, for right now, for the key people who need to come together, how do we divvy it up between the future and who will look to the future and coordinate, but who will look at modernizing what we've done in the past and maintaining those good things? Don't let them go into, turn into potholes everywhere. Boy, that's a challenge. I think figuring out how to overcome, I said before, but it's in my heart, political divide in order to get to these, choices. Who goes this way and who goes this way? And both are critical.
Very good, thanks. Chris, as being the voice of local government, whether you want to or not today, and recognizing that you're probably the youngest of the group here and not having been around this enterprise in 1970, really probably at the local government level, particularly in larger cities, not so much medium and small cities, the capacity has increased dramatically, it seems. How do you see that playing out in terms of the dynamic of the relationship with much more sophistication and capacity at the local level?
Well, I think, capacity can often fluctuate from a specific individual to individual. I think the sophistication and knowledge piece is important as well. And I think it also can get to some of what Kathy was talking about in terms of where we articulating commonality in terms of nature of the issue, even in places where there may be an element of political divide. So one line I use all the time is that city halls are always making environmental or climate decisions. They're often just not calling it that. And so the most important environmental policy or investment maker in a city hall may not be the head of the Department of Environment or the chief sustainability officer. It may be the head of public works. It may be, and it almost is definitely the head of the water department. And so I think that changes the nature potentially of what the conversation is. I also think, and this is some of what I think Cass is getting to is, you know, as we think about issues of resilience and adaptation, and using that as a potential entree into issues of political around the political divide. I think that's important because one, often, you know, stuff rolls downhill, and so the nature of disasters means that it falls back very much to local and state governments to pick up the pieces of those. And disasters can mean a lot of different things. Disasters are not just a tornado or a massive flood. It's the constant increase of, you know, basins being flooded in Chicago. It's changes to farmland in counties, and how are county officials or co-ops dealing or managing with that as well. Those things that are never going to rise to like a FEMA declaration, that falls back to cities, that falls back to counties, that falls back to states that have to manage that on a regular basis. So I think there are opportunities to think, particularly in that the resilience and adaptation place, where maybe mitigation simply is too hot of an issue to ultimately take head on. So I do think that there is something, there is a there, if you will. I would say the other piece is, and this also goes back to this question of collaboration, is you know, often in the development side of the world, they talk about like the stack, right? Like, what is the stack of money that's coming to a project? You talk to any developer, they'll talk about the stack. And so I think there's also there is an analogy there for government as well in terms of thinking about stack. Stack can be a lot of different things. Stack could be investment dollars. So if local governments or local enterprise funds can be put to a water project, for instance, that focuses on green infrastructure, right? Are there revolving loan funds from the state? Are there other funds coming from EPA or from other agencies that can help essentially build that stack of funding for programs or dollars? I think there's also analogy in terms of policy. So what happens at the jurisdictional level that maybe falls within the regulatory framework of EPA that's coming from headquarters, that there's at least some flexibility in terms of execution at the regional level, then how are you working with, in Illinois, how are you working with an IEPA? What is an IEPA doing? What is the General Assembly doing with respect to that? Then how are you working with the city of Chicago, a county like Cook, the metropolitan planning organizations, and others? So I think that and that's also just frankly a way of just breaking down the whale, which I think becomes vitally important as well. So that creates another opportunity for cooperation, and that allows everyone to bring something to the table that also just does not, you know, frankly, just seem overwhelming.
Great, Chris, thanks. Tom, you're kind of Mr. In-Between here, and your perspective on this maturing of programs and increasing of capacity across the board.
I think it's a really interesting observation. One of the things that I believe, if you were to ask the states today, what do they, or many states would say in response to the question, how do you feel about the maturation of all these laws? I think probably what you'd hear from many of them is, yes, they have matured. We have matured in terms of our understanding of these laws and how to implement these laws. The problem is that these laws are now so mature that they're aging out.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know how difficult it has been to build the kind of consensus we need at the national level to be able to amend the laws. And well, of course, we had success with the Lautenberg Act a few years ago with TSCA, but efforts to try to even open up the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, for example, to do some pretty simple things in relative terms, meet with all kinds of resistance because people are afraid of what else might happen, of losing control. And the problem is that more and more these laws just don't provide the authorities that are needed to address the new kinds of problems that we're facing, and particularly on within the timeframes that we want. Take PFAS as an example, where the Safe Drinking Water Act isn't really written in a way that clearly tells EPA, you could go ahead and just decide that this is something you need to set an MCL for. And it's taken a long time. I think they're going to get there, but it's taking a while. So yes, we can do a lot, for example, through e-enterprise to modernize how we deliver under the existing laws. But because those existing laws often just really aren't responsive, to Chris's point, what's happening is more and more state laws and local laws are stepping in to fill the void, which creates huge uncertainty and unpredictability for entities operating at a national scale, for sure. But at the same time, we're also seeing the common law more and more actually being brought back in and used because the federal laws may not necessarily provide the kinds of protections that folks at a local level are looking for. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we're seeing, that we're almost going back to the beginning again here with how we're approaching some of all of this. But I do think that the federal laws are going to have to start to be brought up to speed, because if they are not, we are going to see more and more activity at the local level, people basically setting the standards there, and that's going to create just a lot of inconsistency probably nationally, where we have some communities that are much more forward thinking and looking than others, and others that are holding on to the baseline standards that are those initial minimum federal standards, just for example. But ultimately, it does come back to Kathy's point, which is that we can't lose the progress we've made, and we need to figure out how we tell the story very well about what we've accomplished and why our environmental laws and the funding that we put into all of this has in fact made such a big difference and improved our economy and our way of life, our standard of living.
Great, Tom and Chris and Kathy. Tom, your points about how the laws have not necessarily kept up with the times and the nature of the problems and other aspects. I know one thing during my career that struck me was how unsuited, particularly Superfund, maybe TSCA and RCRA, how unsuited they were to really deal with the brownfields situation. And I think it took a lot of creativity to make the right things happen. And frankly, there were times when I was kind of glad there wasn't a law. And through, if you will, creative lawyering in the best sense of the word, and creative engineering and creative public engagement and creative development, a lot of good things did happen. Tom, maybe I'll start with you. And did you have any experience in this brownfields area? And what was it that helped make that program work in the areas where you were?
Thanks, Dave. As a matter of fact, after about 6 or 7 years of law practice, found myself working on behalf of our state's Business and Industry Association with members of our legislature to craft one of the fairly early state brownfield statutes, which was really a response to exactly what you described, this frustration that people were afraid to get developers, the kinds who were building the stacks that Chris was describing of funds, were afraid to commit funds to properties where they didn't know if they were buying into unlimited liability. And we were able to convince the legislature in New Hampshire that we could have a win-win, where we could effectively incent people with appropriate liability protections to come in, take ownership of these otherwise not very attractive properties, but sometimes actually properties that didn't have a whole lot of problem, but there was the perception that they were plagued, and get them cleaned up and get them back on the tax rolls. And we've had some great success here in New Hampshire, as many other states have. Fortunately, Congress has seen fit to provide a fair amount of funding over the years to help move a lot of these projects forward. And so I think it is a very good example of ways in which, in fact, the laws have evolved to address what we've learned from the shortcomings of our existing statutes. So it gives me hope that there are ways we can do better.
Great. Chris, I don't know if you and your innovation responsibilities or others got into the brownfields world at all, but any perspectives on that in context of federal, state, local?
Well, I think, actually the Region 5 staff for us in Chicago was tremendously helpful, particularly in terms of projects and work on the southeast side of the city, which is, for those who aren't familiar, a very heavily industrialized area of Chicago. And we were able to work with both a combination of the Region 5 team, Illinois EPA, and our Department of Health, where our environmental team sat, on projects around testing, cleanup, et cetera. This is actually another example of kind of where the stack happened, right? So the city, and in one case, the city actually went in and did an early study of contamination levels of manganese in an area. We were able to provide that study back to the Region 5 staff, who went and did their own study and marked the area as contaminated, and then began the process of cleanup. We were fortunate enough to be kind of early in to the process, and going back to the nature of those relationships. I think the Department of Health staff in Chicago had a very good and long-standing relationship with Region 5 staff, and that is actually, and at the same time, so you have that going on, good cooperation, good work, whereas you basically have how do I put this? A fight, a kind of a never-ending fight, if you will, between Mayor Emanuel and Administrator Wheeler. That we were just taking pot shots whenever we. I mean, from a political standpoint, wherever we could, and it was candidly easy. There's a lot of fodder there, and so this goes back to what Kathy was talking about. How do you create space for the work while the politics do what they do, right? So, like, I am a political hack. I fully admit that, but I also understand that the work of government still has to move, and so this becomes a question: is like, how do you actually find space and find the ways of cooperation and work, which we were able to do while at the same time we were taking EPA to court for lack of enforcement on Clean Water Act actions in Indiana and IDNR. And so I think that's the real tension, that's the real magic that EPA staff do on a daily basis. And how do you kind of push away the noise, which also means that it's important that staff just keep coming to the table. Sometimes, and I tell folks, sometimes you fight with your friends. And so you got to keep bringing the donuts and the coffee, and whatever platter Kathy created for that meeting where she told those folks no. I'm sure it was a great spread. And so it's relentless, right? Because this is an iterative game that we're playing, that sometimes folks quote unquote win and sometimes folks quote unquote lose.
Yeah, that balancing act, recognizing the political realities and then just doing what you need to do to kind of get the job done was always quite an interesting challenge. And I know I got a better appreciation for it when I worked for 130 mayors at the time. I do know, Chris, that one of the things Region 5 did early in the process was we actually detailed a person under an intergovernmental personnel agreement to the city of Chicago. Jim Vanderkloot to really get the brownfields program up and running. And the old adage of until you walk in another person's shoes, you really don't know. And I think Jim developed a real appreciation for, all of the realities of working in local government. Kathy, your perspectives on this?
Well, I would say that the brownfield situation that I tended to get locked into when I was with EPA, and I was at a fairly high level of the organization at the time, were ones that were debating, is this a Superfund site? Is this a brownfield site? So, they're in a category by themselves. But I would, with great respect, say that New York and New Jersey, and later on Puerto Rico, I've lost track of the Virgin Islands, developed their own brownfields, programs. And they defined what they were prepared to deal with. And that program, they had some state funding, but it also prepared communities to apply for EPA brownfields grants. So I think that issue became, went from a negative one of, oh my God, we're letting people get away with murder, to no, we're allowing the economy to be restored where it's appropriate, was largely due to the state actions and EPA's cooperation and then funding. But it's kind of an interesting, back track of activities for that one, I think.
I might just add to that EPA has provided some very helpful guidance in some of the regulations that it has adopted in terms of innocent landowner protections and that kind of stuff. So it has effectively helped to create a sort of a national minimum standard that provides consistent guidance for developers and funders, insurers, and others who might make those projects happen. So that everybody knows what the game is and what it entails. But I think Kathy's exactly right. This collaborative process among states and EPA in particular have I think really helped to provide some very significant environmental protections and progress.
Well, very good. Now here comes the big fat softball for each one of you to hit out of the park. And Chris, you get the first swing at this one. And that is, in your experience in local government, what did you consider your most successful exercise, if you will, in federal, state, local cooperation? Was there one that stands out particularly in your mind that you look back on and say, yeah, that's the way it should be? I sure hope there's at least one. And if not federal, state, and local, at least local and state or local and federal.
Yeah. I would actually go back. I would go back to some of the work that was happening that we were doing on the southeast side. I would say in particular. So going back to the analogy of kind of what can you bring to the table, right? And so from the city standpoint, we could bring so both for this project in terms of manganese, and there were some other projects and work in sites on the southeast side as well. So, the city could bring police enforcement or police power, if you will, in terms of either shutting down sites or, creating restrictions or whatnot, showing kind of actively that first steps have been taken that are associated with it. I think cities could also bring people to articulate the concerns and problems that they were seeing in their communities. The state IEPA was often able to bring jurisdictional authority. Part of the tricky, what makes it tricky in a state like Illinois, for instance, the authority that municipalities have around environmental protection is actually relatively limited by state statute. Cities have authority around public health. Cities have authority around blight. But environmental protection was actually an area that basically local authority had to be granted by either the state constitution or the state legislature to local municipalities. And if that was not explicit, then it automatically went to the state through IEPA. So they brought jurisdictional authority to work and to some of the work, and EPA was able to bring, just candidly, as Dave, as you said, as your friends in Michigan alluded to, like EPA was able to provide funding with respect to that, right? So the city's ability to facilitate, mitigation efforts for that type of work was limited, was basically non-existent. And so that was actually a good example, I think, of the sequencing that was able to happen, that the local agencies were able to step in first to do kind of as much as they could. And at that point, it was handed off to the state. The state worked and did as much as they could. And then the federal government came in with additional actions while conversations and work were happening at all times. So I actually thought that was, yes, we all wanted it to be faster. Yes, we all wanted to do more, like take a number on the number of times you say that. But I think that was actually a good example of showing like this sequencing can work, this stacking can work if there's an oversharing and over communication of information, and if folks are given the space to frankly just do their jobs.
Whenever you mention the southeast side of Chicago, Chris, I always think of Altgeld Gardens and PCB concerns down there. And then reading, I think it was President Obama's, one of his early books, Dreams of My Father, whatever. I think some of the earliest community engagement work he did was in Altgeld Gardens down on the
Well, then
south.
I'll tell. Yep.
So there's a future for everyone who community engagement. Tom, you look back on most favorably in terms of this federal, state, local dynamic and success stories?
Sure, thank you. I'm going to be a little bit of a broken record here, Dave, because I want to come back to this notion of collaboration and e-enterprise for the environment, which for me, candidly, was perhaps the most fulfilling professional experience I've ever had. Not only because of the extraordinary people I got to know and work with through that, but the fact that at least so far this is enduring. This is an initiative that started under the Obama administration, survived, and in fact, in some respects, was understood and embraced by a Trump administration, and now is being again embraced and given new life under the Biden administration. Why? Because fundamentally, it's just about good government. This is about, actually, I just want to come to Cheryl Wasserman's question. This is about really figuring out how we do exactly what the challenge is today. That is, how do we do environmental protection in an area, in an arena, and a time in which nobody has the money or the resources that they want or they need. And I think Cheryl is absolutely right. If you look at her question, that it does take more effort up front. It takes a greater commitment of time and resources to do the kind of collaborative work that is to really understand what is the city of Chicago's problem that they have that they're trying to solve. How does that problem fit with the state of perhaps Illinois' problem? How does that fit with the problem that Kathy's successors at if she had been at Region 5 would be facing in with a particular kind of water issue or whatever else? And then from that, figuring, okay, what is it that we could do that meets everybody's needs, that we can actually get done here? That's the basic principle that I think e-enterprise is striving for. It's as much about a philosophy as it is about specific projects. So I would urge folks, if you're not already familiar with this, go to the EPA website. There's a lot of information there on e-enterprise for the environment. There's also a link to a separate site that was set up by ECOS, Environmental Council of the States, that has a whole lot more detailed information on specific projects that have been done. But there have been dozens, if not more than 100 projects now over the past 8 or 9 years, where we really have brought teams together of folks from different orders of government, to use your term, Dave, to collectively figure out, okay, what's the problem that we have, for example, in doing quality assurance project plans, and figuring out how we can streamline that process and make sure that we know we're getting good data to support the decisions we're making. Or how do we build a data system that can support air permitting more effectively in a way that works for everybody. That's what it's going to take, I believe. And fortunately, folks are really rolling up their sleeves, getting into it. And that's the kind of model that I think offers the greatest hope, both today and in the future, particularly when we look at this world that Chris has been speaking about of climate change. It's just going to affect everything that we do. And we have to get a whole lot better at collectively figuring out what those problems are. How do we address that? Last thought I'll just share quickly on this point is that I do think that the technology, for example, that we're using on this very call here, particularly in the form of Teams that now EPA is using, the form of SharePoint or other similar platforms where you can collectively, jointly and concurrently develop documents, is going to promote collaboration, is already promoting collaboration in new ways that weren't imaginable even maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And these tools are only going to get better and better as time goes on.
Well, Tom, you are not a broken record at all. And particularly for those of us who have been gone for now almost 20 years. And I remember when I first heard about e-enterprise, I said, what the heck is that? So I think a lot of the people on the phone really have not experienced that. So that was very helpful. Kathy, what do you look back on with most pleasure in terms of successes?
Well, I guess I look back on the ability to work with states and sort of bring that, not quite friendship, but often, and always respect to the table, no matter how difficult the problems were. I just, so that's like a big picture thing. And then a somewhat, it was a big deal, but it was a smaller picture thing. Sewage treatment plant was out of compliance in a lake, probably should have never been allowed to discharge into this lake, and EPA should have approved it to discharge into the river. They could have met standards much better, but it was approved in the lake. And so later people come along and say, it's in violation. The state of New York sued the sewage treatment plant and got nowhere because of a very, very powerful county. And finally EPA entered before I came on the scene. And then one of the NGO heads who I had met a couple of times, very superficial meetings, called me late. He called my office one night at 7 and I picked up the phone. That was the path to getting this resolved, oddly enough, because he figured out I worked late a lot of the time. So he'd call me all the time, asking me to get involved personally. Please try to help make New York State move, make EPA move. And I'd say, what do you need? Okay. And then I talked to my people, and then I talked to the state, and we finally got together, all of us. He had never been brought to the table before, the NGO fellow. We got the issue resolved. They signed a consent agreement to get into compliance in a schedule that everybody was satisfied with. I was really proud, and ironically, one of the things that got us on the right track was food. They never came together and had bagels and coffee. Come on. And that's what we got to fix on Zoom. I don't know how we get food into Zoom. But anyway, I was very proud of that personally, that I had so many people telling me, we can't listen to this guy, he's crazy. And I listened anyway, and he wasn't crazy, and we all compromised and got a resolution. So that's one of the things I'm particularly proud of.
Well, very good. We're down to our last 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask each of you to take 1 minute so that I have time to say that this is the most fabulous panel that has ever been assembled. You guys are just wonderful. But uh, what advice would you give to a young person who is interested in a career of public service about this federal, state, local dynamic and what they might expect? Because I came in knowing nothing about it. So Kathy, why don't you start out, and then Tom and Chris, I'll give you the last word.
Okay,
What advice would you give?
couple of words. When you get here, the state, the municipalities, the tribes are not your enemies.
Very good, very good. Tom, how about you?
I'm not sure I can be quite that succinct, but I think what I would add to that is the public simply expects government to do its job. And it really doesn't care or pay attention necessarily to what level of government actually gets it done. The public is just grateful when the job is done right, it's done well, and that's to everybody's benefit. So I would tell anybody new coming into government, just do the best you can and promote strong collaborative efforts with your counterparts in other parts of government. Understand they are not your enemy. That you don't necessarily have to carry the political baggage that the politicians may be carrying around with you. Go about doing your job. Let the politicians deal with the politics on it. But recognize that basically everybody's operating on the same plane you are, and if you approach it that way, together we all serve one public, and that's what's going to allow us all to be successful and to make for I think a very productive and just enjoyable career.
Very good, Tom. Thanks a lot. Chris?
Going back to the components, some of the components we've talked about what do you bring to the table, and having an understanding of place and articulation, and as you think about collaboration and cooperation, those are very easy words to say, and as Tom and Kathy have articulated, they're very hard to do. So having an understanding, appreciation of what you do, and of what you bring. And I tell kind of younger folks all the time, you got to kind of work. You can't work from a place of fear, which I think is critically important right now, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. And I think that the problems that we try to face are hard. They are problems, decades, if not centuries, in the making. And so the expectation that you will solve them tomorrow is asking a lot and putting a lot of burden on your shoulders. So how to work from a place of hope is critically important.
Well, very good. My advice, of course, would be always plenty of coffee, donuts, and bagels to make things work. On a more serious note, thank you all very, very much. Your perceptions and observations and thoughts have been extremely informative, entertaining, and everything. And I greatly appreciate the time that you took. And it's been wonderful to see all of you again. And there are some wonderful things about this virtual world that I hope we will be able to use to our greatest advantage in the future. Chuck or Beth, are there any final words that you need to add? Chuck, go ahead.
Well, I would just say that our audience stuck with us through this. I think that's the greatest compliment I can give the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, thanks again, and happy Independence Day, or whatever in the heck you might want to celebrate.
Thank you all.
Dan.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.